let's just get started then. So again, thank you so much for everybody that has decided to join us today. I wanted to take a second and just welcome everybody to our webinar. So my name is Krista Early, and I'm an advocate with Environment North Carolina. I'm also joined today by Ula Reeves, the Senior Advocacy Manager for the AIR program with the National Parks Conservation Association, Joshua Smith, the Senior Attorney with Sierra Club's Environmental Law Program, Joel Porter, the Policy Manager, and Deja Williams, the Environmental Justice Manager for Clean Air NC. We are gathered here today to talk about what to do about haze pollution. We're actually going to discuss the problem of haze pollution, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. But first, let's just take a second and define what haze pollution actually is. So air visibility is impacted by natural pollution, like forest fires and dust clouds, as well as man-made pollution. The primary culprit for haze is particulate matter, which can be formed by any number of chemicals binding together. Today's discussion, however, will mostly focus on sulfur dioxides and nitrogen oxides. So there are regulations for this pollution, and the goal of haze regulations, and specifically the haze program in North Carolina, is to make visibility better and to clean up the air in Class 1 areas, which are national parks and wilderness areas. Specifically in North Carolina, we have 5 Class 1 areas that Ula will talk about. So with that said, I wanted to give the floor to Ula so she can share more about that.
Great. Thank you, Krista. Hi, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to share my screen here, so bear with me one moment. All right, let's see here. All right, can everyone see that okay?
Yep.
Okay, super. Well, thanks again so much for having me. See a few familiar faces or names on our list, so glad to have you all. Before we jump in, I want to invite everybody to use the chat feature. I think Krista's our chat box enabled. All right. Love for some of you to just jump in, and if you've ever been to a national park or a wilderness area, where do you go? What do you expect from your experience there? I'd love to see some of the answers in the chat box, and maybe Krista, if I'm not seeing it, you can help me out.
Looks like someone says they go for peace and beauty and nature.
What else?
Yep, just echoing that sentiment, peace and quiet.
Connection. Yeah, I'm seeing
biodiversity.
I bet a little exercise.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah, all right. All right, Joshua says for the views and the scenery. Yeah. So yeah, some of you are saying views and hiking, yeah, exercise. So we go to these places a lot of times to experience the disconnection and the connection to these really special outdoor places that we have. And we're so lucky to have a number of them here in North Carolina. Long-range views, scenic views are a big part of why we go to these places, and being able to breathe clean air and enjoy that when we're outside relaxing or exercising. These are fundamental parts of why we like to be outside. And it's good for our health. Those views can be awe-inspiring and grounding at the same time. They bring us perspective and an important sense of place. When we can't see those views, if they're shrouded, we know that our experience too can be muted and less fulfilling. And when the air quality is bad enough to not see those views, you can be sure that we are breathing in that pollution as well. So let me jump in. Let's Sorry, there's something a little bit funky going on with presentation here, and I'm not totally sure. Okay. So let's do a little bit of history. So the value of those view sheds that I was just mentioning and clean air was recognized many years ago by Congress. In 1977, there were amendments passed by a bipartisan Congress to address air pollution causing visibility impairment across our nation. And specifically in places like these treasured natural areas of national parks and wildernesses. And in response to fulfill that mandate, the Regional Haze Rule was established in 1995 by the EPA, and it's now the blueprint to reduce and eventually eliminate human-caused air pollution in America's most iconic national parks and wilderness areas. So there are 156 across the country. 48 of those are national parks and 108 of those are wilderness areas. Once a decade, states must develop plans to lower air pollution affecting these places until eventually natural air is restored. And the goal of the program is to make continuous progress and progressive improvements in air quality over time. This is not a one and done program. States are supposed to be identifying new ways of making reductions in emissions every decade. And right now, all across the country, states are in their second planning process for regional haze. The plans were originally due to EPA by the end of July of this year, but most states are still working on their plans. And North Carolina is in the public comment phase of developing the plan right now. So, sorry. There's something a little bit funny, and I apologize, going on here. So what are those protected Class 1 areas in the Southeast and North Carolina? So here's a map of those protected areas. Many in the Southeast are wilderness areas, but in North Carolina, we also have the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And those 4 wilderness areas are Joyce-Kilmer, Slick Rock, Linville Gorge, Shining Rock, and Swan Quarter Wilderness out on the coast. And Great Smoky Mountains actually ranks 9th in the nation among national parks for pollution burden from haze. And Mammoth Cave, also in our Southeast region, ranks 3rd. This is from air quality monitoring data. And so these are some of our most haze polluted parks in the country. And these statistics underscore the importance and the need for North Carolina to have a strong haze plan. So what exactly is haze? Haze is a combination of air pollution. So Krista mentioned this briefly, but this is a combination of air pollution, particles and gases that block light and cut visual range and clarity and color from our views. Primary haze pollutants are nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxides, and particulate matter. And then in addition, volatile organic compounds are part of the chemical equation that forms haze, and both VOCs and nitrogen oxides lead to the formation of ozone as well, which is a dangerous air pollution issue for people's health. So these pollutants come from a range of industrial facilities like paper mills or chemical manufacturing, as well as coal-fired power plants and vehicles. And in other parts of the country, things like oil and gas development are part of the issue. Most of the pollution that ends up harming air quality in national parks does not originate inside the parks. Air pollution really knows no boundaries, and it can travel hundreds of miles away to obscure views and harm our health, which is why every single state has to develop their own plan. Okay. I mentioned there are these co-benefits. So haze isn't just about the views. The very same sources of pollution that I just mentioned not only muddy the skies in our national parks and wilderness areas, but they are the very same sources that harm local communities, often low-income communities and communities of color experience this air pollution first and worst. These pollutants are harmful for our lungs, our hearts, and cause a variety of illnesses and other health complications. But this is also a gift and an opportunity because there are so many ways that cleaning up the air can benefit us, not just the outdoor places that are protected under this rule, but also our communities and our climate and the health of our ecosystems. So when states develop strong plans, this means clearer skies for us, healthier air in our parks, and also our communities and our planet. So to develop haze plans, states first identify the main sources of visibility impairing pollution that are potentially affecting these Class 1 areas, and not just those places in their state. So North Carolina is beholden to look at their contribution to air quality problems at these Class 1 areas in other states as well. They're supposed to be evaluating a host of factors to determine emission cutting requirements that they will propose. And National Parks Conservation Association, my organization, we did our own analysis and determined that there are 28 industrial facilities that are potentially harming the air in protected areas across the Southeast. And all across the larger region, there are collectively 241 facilities that contribute to visibility impairment in our North Carolina Class 1 areas. So of the nearly 30 facilities in North Carolina that are contributing to the formation of haze, the Division of Air Quality chose to look at 3 of those facilities, and those are on the top of the list in blue. They're not proposing any new emission controls to these facilities, even though they did a full analysis on them. And another concern that we have is that North Carolina has not looked at nitrogen oxide. So I mentioned there are a number of pollutants cause haze, and nitrogen oxides is one of those important haze impairing pollutants that needs to be considered. Facilities in red are those that are omitted from consideration in North Carolina's plan. And most notably, I would point out that Duke Energy's coal-fired power plants were not fully analyzed, and they should have been, because these are some of North Carolina's top haze polluters. These facilities also should have been analyzed for nitrogen oxides. And Joel's going to talk a little bit more about that. So these are the types of things that we'd expect to see in a strong plan. So really looking at what are those pollution control devices that need to be upgraded or added to really bring emissions down. Where can retirements of coal facilities be locked in to ensure that they actually happen over time and deliver that clean air, and it is something that the state can count on and ensure that it's going to happen going forward. So I apologize for the pausing here back and forth on the slides, but I am going to just end on this slide and say that we are in the middle of this comment period. We are very eager to have folks joining us in making comments to the state while this comment period is open. There is a public hearing next week on October 6th at 6 p.m. and we can get the registration info put into the chat box. And we look forward to hearing more questions and comments throughout this presentation. And I will hand the floor back to Kristen. Thank you very much for the time.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Ula. Those remarks were great. And it really is awesome to kind of hear about the overview and history of the issues that we're dealing with. Right now, I really want to kick this over to Josh, who can review our Haze State Implementation Plan and the historical context of the program.
Thanks, Krista. I will make an effort not to repeat some of Ula's good points, and we don't need to go into all of it over again. I do want to just emphasize a couple of points on the legal framework. And again, the Clean Air Act itself requires states to adopt enforceable emission limitations to address haze pollution in Class 1 areas. So when we are evaluating SIPs, as you're looking to make comments, the intention to stop operating a plant or reduce its operations is not enough. That needs to be incorporated as a binding commitment within the SIP, an federally enforceable commitment. So that is going to be a key part of evaluating SIPs going forward. What happens after the state submits its SIP? EPA will then take the SIP up and will provide another opportunity for public comment and notice, giving us yet another opportunity to put information into the record about cost-effective controls for each pollutant coming from a particular source. And primarily, we're concerned with sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides and particulate matter. And so why does that matter? And let me try to share my screen a little bit as well. Pardon me. Let's see. Let me see if I'm, go back. Can you all see what I've got here? I can't see at the same time what I'm sharing, but hopefully you can see the first screen that I've got.
Yeah, we can.
Okay. So why does this matter in particular for the coal campaign in the first round of Regional Haze SIPs? It mattered because we were looking at older sources, and in particular what's called BART, or Best Available Retrofit Technology sources. These were the oldest and dirtiest sources around, built generally before 1977 without modern pollution controls. This time around, the states are required to reevaluate those older sources, but also newer sources and area sources, as Ula said, oil and gas. It may be in some states, LNG, liquefied natural gas facilities, etc. And the kinds of controls that we're looking at are for sulfur dioxide, upgraded or retrofitted scrubbers, flue gas desulfurization, for nitrogen oxides, selective catalytic reduction systems, and for particulate matter, sometimes baghouses. All of these controls tend to increase capital and operational expenses at these facilities. And I'll talk for a minute why this is and was important to the coal campaign at Sierra Club in the first round. But first of all, why does it matter overall to Haze? In the first round of plans, the Haze program secured 1.4 million tons reduced of visibility impairing pollution. This meant about 146 coal plants that were either required to install controls or shut down in round one. The shutdowns, of course, resulted in many millions of tons of reduced climate-causing pollution. We believe, and what should happen is this second round should produce the same kinds of results. One of the key things I'd like to mention here is this is a big deal to the coal plant operators and other sources. And in fact, in the first round, the Koch brothers famously called the Haze program the stealth weapon on the war on coal. So that's something we want to consider as we go forward. In the first round, the coal campaign and others, NPCA and other organizations throughout the United States secured a number of retirements related to regional haze implementation. And here are just a few of those examples. Each of these facilities had one or more units that were required to retire as a result of round one. We expect the same again going forward in the second round. And as Ula said, these same pollutants have significant benefits to health and to climate, and that connection is not only should be obvious to many of us, but EPA itself has recognized that in July of this year, issued a clarification memo urging, pardon me.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We're not seeing your slides more.
Okay, let me unshare. I'm sorry. Here, pardon me here. Let me escape here. Stop sharing. There we go. All right. I have many things going on my screen. Apologies for that. And in July of this year, EPA issued a guidance memo, and just reiterating some of the things that both Ula and I mentioned at the outset. With respect to health benefits, the agency made clear that the regions and the states should be evaluating environmental justice concerns and climate concerns associated with their plans. In addition, state plans should have additional additive reductions above and beyond what occurred in round one. So there really should be new reductions taking place here. Again, any retirements or reduced operations need to be in the SIP as binding and federally enforceable commitments. And the fact that a particular class 1 area is getting better, sometimes you'll hear this be referred to as being on the glide slope, glide path. The fact that a visibility in a particular class 1 area is getting better or on track to achieve natural visibility is not enough. And states really do need to impose cost-effective controls for those facilities. And with that, I'll pass it back to Krista.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Josh. Hearing all of that just adds to the picture and really gives us a really great standpoint to start from. It looks like we have a question for our panelists. So this is the second round of regional, or is this the second? Hold on. Actually read this here. So this is the second round of regional haze evaluation. She says that she keeps hearing it's the first round. Yeah, and it looks like Ula has said it's the second round of planning. So with that, I will pass this over to Joel to talk about the issues with the North Carolina State Implementation Plan and really what we can do moving forward.
Thanks, Krista. So our organization, Clean Air and Sea, our mission is to reduce sources of emissions in our state. So taking action on this issue is really clear for us. And as has been mentioned earlier, the spirit and the intent of this law is very clear. It's to improve over time visibility and air quality in class 1 areas. And because air is static, improving air in these areas improves air in the entire state, in the entire region, in the entire nation. So it's a win-win for everybody. DAQ has done some pretty good work on this, but they've got a long way to go. As Ula mentioned, they haven't decided to include a very important pollutant, nitrous oxides, in their state implementation plan. And as Josh was just talking about, that would include coal-fired power plants and other fossil fueled plants. Now, there's a lot going on right now on climate change, on energy policy, on all of these different issues that affect climate change and the environment and energy. But again, the purpose of this law is very clear. It's a tool that's in the toolbox that's ready to be used for a very specific purpose. DAQ isn't going outside of the bounds by selecting nitrous oxide. In fact, other parts of the country do include nitrous oxides, and it wouldn't be a stretch for us to do so either. And relying on any of these other things that are going on outside of the box, whether it's the feds looking at budget reconciliation bill or the infrastructure bill that they're considering, or the state looking at legislation to close power plants early, that's outside of the scope of this. The scope of this law is very clear here. They can take action, and they should take action. And that's what we're really trying to say to the state. And we hope others will join in and let their voices be known on this subject as well. Obviously, the coal plants are important. Our organization would be extremely happy if all of the sources of pollution that Ula mentioned, the 28 different sources were included in this SIP. And I think that if they were, they would have some drastic benefits to the communities in which these plants operate, in terms of the environment, in terms of the health, and in terms of real lives. So there are a lot of benefits that we can talk about today and we can get to later. But I'll stop there, and that's kind of the big overarching issue with kind of what is and what isn't included in the SIP so far.
Awesome. All right, well, thank you for that clarification. And now we will hear from Deja Williams about the haze effects on our communities and how they're dealing with it.
Yeah, hey everyone. Thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited to be here with you all to provide a different perspective on this program through the environmental justice lens, which some of my colleagues have touched upon briefly. But before we dive into that, I wanted to kind of give a general definition of what environmental justice is. And it can be defined as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of their race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development and enforcement of environmental laws and policies. So when we say fair treatment, in this sense, we mean that no population or community should have to bear a disproportionate share of negative environmental consequences resulting from things such as industrial operations, which generate tons of pollution, which we've heard about today, or from the execution of federal or state regulations and policies, such as the Haze program. And the reason why it's important to take these environmental justice issues into consideration for this rule is because I think what has been very greatly illustrated here today is that this rule is not just about parks and public lands, or even about improving air quality in just national parks. Haze pollution often has the most harmful consequences for those who are located closest to the sources of pollution. So it's also about protecting air quality for all. So as Josh has as everyone has touched upon, with this program, we're talking about sources from refineries, cement facilities, electric generation stations, and a whole host of other industrial facilities. And in North Carolina, that Ula has touched upon, there has been nearly 30 facilities identified that are potentially affecting visibility in our parks, but only 3 are being considered for emissions reductions. And this is really concerning because every single one of these facilities produce a host of the harmful pollutants that we've heard about today, such as nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, VOCs, among other nasty pollutants, all of which contribute to haze, but also contribute to the health and environmental impacts in communities surrounding these activities, which are mostly located in areas where the majority of residents are minorities or are living below the poverty line. So, you know, we've heard about the coal power plants that are not being included as a source for emission reductions or being considered for emissions reductions. And this is really bad because pollution from coal causes serious health effects and actually contributes to 4 of the 5 leading causes of death in North Carolina. And Black and low-income communities mostly live near coal plants and have been hit the hardest in our state. Just to provide another example, another facility of concern that contributes to haze but is not being considered is the Pilkington Glass Manufacturing Facility. And this is located in Scotland County, and it's surrounded by a community that is 51% minority and where 24% of the population falls below the poverty line. So if you're not considering these facilities and their emissions, these communities will continue to suffer and bear the disproportionate share of pollution in our state. And just in kind of wrapping up my point, through this program, our state not only has the opportunity to increase benefits of our treasured open spaces so we can enjoy our parks more, but the opportunity arises also to be an advocate and to advance the quality of life for our most vulnerable North Carolina communities through updating the SIP and including not only more emission sources, but also including reductions for more pollutants that are being emitted from these facilities. And it will also ensure that the burden doesn't continue to fall on these community shoulders.
Well, great. Thank you so much for that. That kind of just gave it like a personal viewpoint into how this plan really is affecting North Carolinians and all of our communities across the state. So again, thank you so much to all of our panelists for just kind of explaining what's going on with the state implementation plan and all the ins and outs of what this policy needs. And right now I want to open it up to potential questions. So if anyone has questions, please put them in the chat and I will kind of manage that and read them out to our panelists. It looks like Rachel just recently asked a question. If sulfur dioxide is the pollutant of concern, then how can they justify not evaluating our coal plants? Isn't that a major source?
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. So things get very complicated very fast when you start looking at regional haze. There's a lot of modeling that goes in, and North Carolina participated in a modeling and planning effort with a number of other regional states, Southeast regional states. And through that modeling process, they determined that only a very small handful of sources were the ones that they were going to look at. Essentially the bar was set extraordinarily high for how they screened those facilities and determined which ones to look at. So Rachel, it's a great question. We do feel that the coal plants are significant contributors and they absolutely should have been considered, both for sulfur dioxide and for nitrogen oxides.
And Ula, correct me if I'm wrong here, but those power plants have controls that exist already that can be used to control both of these pollutants.
Some of them do, some of them don't. Some of them are looking at retirement. I think the Marshall Steam Station is a great example of a facility that needs much better controls and is not properly controlled for the haze pollutants at this time. But even the facilities that are looking at retirement at some point in the future, those need to be locked into the haze plan in order for the state to count them. Because when a utility makes an announcement, it's just an announcement. Unless it's an enforceable retirement requirement, they can change their mind. And so if it's going to be benefiting our national parks and our wilderness areas and improving haze pollution, then those commitments need to be locked in.
Thanks, Ula.
This is Josh, just one other quick follow-on to Joel's question. I think it is something to keep in mind that even if a plant does have controls, maybe it's got a scrubber, the utility oftentimes does not operate it at its most efficient level. And so we should be advocating for more stringent controls and actually operating the equipment that they have. That's what it's there for. So do it all the time and incorporate that as an enforceable limitation in the SIP.
So it seems like that might even be cost effective, even if they didn't have to close down.
It is, and in some situations it is worth making that argument, especially for plants that have retirement dates that are out into the late 2020s or early 2030s even. Yes.
Great. Okay, so this question is for Josh and Ula. So all this sounds like DAQ does have the authority to incorporate more polluting facilities in their North Carolina Haze Plan. How does ongoing regulatory and political matters such as the federal or state proposed energy policy reforms and Duke's IRP plans fit into this issue?
Well, yeah. So it's a little bit of what I was saying before, that there are certainly other plans, other programs that can have benefits in terms of air pollution reductions on some of the facilities of concern that can be double counted, if you will. But they have to be codified in the rule in this Haze Plan in order for it to actually be considered part of the haze emission reduction plan. So there are a lot of things happening, and I'll let others on the call who are closer to Duke Energy's IRP process and all of that jump in. But the Duke Energy should be aware of the state's haze obligations, and this could be an opportunity for mutually beneficial agreements here, that if those retirements for those coal plants are coming up, then let's make sure that they get in the haze plan, get locked in through the haze plan. If they're planning on doing it anyway, then it shouldn't be too much of a problem.
Yeah, and I was kind of touching on this earlier in my comments. I think that, you know, you never know what's going to happen politically, and it doesn't really matter what happens politically. This is a law that's on the books. It's existing authority. Nothing has to be changed. It's a tool that can be used now. North Carolina has set some pretty ambitious carbon reduction goals. Our organization is part of, or was part of it's called a petition for rulemaking to put the state in a program called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and that would overlap with this. We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as quickly as possible. We're out of time, and we can't wait for a political solution to emerge. We need to use the tools that we have available to us to get this done.
So Joel, if some of these facilities started paying for their carbon dioxide emissions, how would that actually end up affecting the haze issues at national parks? You said that you were part of the petition group in the rulemaking to have North Carolina deal with that. Yeah, so the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative primarily affects carbon dioxide, but it would increase the cost of fossil fuels and encourage the use of alternative and cleaner energy sources. If you added tighter controls to power plants from a tighter haze SIP, that continues to change the dynamic. So overall, you're going to see cleaner air. And in our petition, we included alternative sources of energy generation beyond just the coal plants. We also included industrial sites that generate up to, I believe, 25 megawatts of electricity that, you know, if they're creating electricity on site for their manufacturing purposes, and it's over 25 megawatts, and then they add that excess energy onto the grid, they're included in RGGI. They're included in how the state is supposed to develop a rule that puts us into that program. Now, if you have a haze rule on top of that, that includes those power plant sites, and maybe even all of these other sites that Ula mentioned would be eligible, those 28 industrial sites, we're all of a sudden talking about real measurable reductions in pollution that can severely help communities deal with a lot of the health effects, the respiratory issues that come with pollution. And a lot of those issues, as Deja mentioned, are in environmental justice communities that have been environmentally impacted for way too long. So this is a way to really create some cumulative benefits in our state. And I think that's important because we haven't really done that, right? Like we haven't really tried to address the cumulative overall impacts in the state before. So in some ways, this is an incredibly important rule. And again, it's why we're so active in this issue. Awesome. Yeah, and just kind of to build off of that a little bit, you're talking about what it would look like if we had a haze plan on top of, say, RGGI or something similar in North Carolina. If North Carolina decided to join RGGI, would that mean that a strong haze plan, state implementation plan, is unnecessary for our state? Would we not even need that at a point?
No, and I think that's what I was just discussing. I think it's quite contrary to that. It would be great because it would, you know, require these pollution controls to be used on industrial sites and on power plants that should be used anyway, but they're not. So as I was kind of getting out of Ula and Josh and my question to them earlier, so I think the overall benefit to the environment could be, tenfold if all of this stuff moves forward. And hopefully folks on the call today will, provide public comment. I put the way to do that in the chat. Also reach out to the governor's office and encourage him to create a strong SIP. He matters in this as well. So I think there's a lot that we can do here to really encourage the state creates a bit stronger SIP than they have, and I'm hopeful that folks will help us do that.
Awesome.
Want to jump in and offer maybe a repeat of something that I said in the beginning, because I think it's relevant to the discussion, Krista and Joel, the things that you were just talking about, which is that the goal of the Haze program is to make continuous and regular progress on emission reductions going forward. So even if North Carolina didn't have 5 big coal plants that were missing from this plant, it would still be obligated to look at the pollution sources that do still exist and to look for ways to make new improvements to those facilities, new emission reductions that would actually bring down haze pollution. So it's not a matter of, have you kicked out the big dirties and then we can rest on our laurels? It's, how do we continue to improve the air quality? Because there are dramatic benefits, all of the reasons we've talked about on this call for doing that. And it's a program that has a very long time span. North Carolina, we've mentioned, has made really great progress in the past. It's not a reason to rest on laurels and say, well, we're good, we're ahead of schedule. That's not the point of the program.
Awesome. Yeah, I think
jump in and follow up to Joel's comments, and I think it goes to Rachel's question in the chat box. If North Carolina fails to evaluate the sources that should be evaluated, what happens? Is there a penalty? And if the advocacy towards the governor doesn't work, that kind of thing, what happens? The plan, and maybe I glossed over this a little too quickly, this plan will then go to EPA for review and approval. And I mentioned that in July, EPA issued a new clarification memo that, in our view, really reprioritizes and clarifies what the states need to be doing in these second round plans. So we fully expect the Biden administration to follow through on what they've said in the clarification memo, and apply those principles to their review of the state plan. And if the state plan is deficient, if there aren't enforceable emission reductions included in the plan, they didn't evaluate appropriate sources, EPA can reject the state plan, or rather has an obligation to reject the state plan and implement a federal plan that does comply with the law. So we have another opportunity to advocate to EPA to really come down on states that don't comply with the law, that refuse to do what they're supposed to do.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that really clarified it for everybody. So Daisha, it sounds like the program update could have some really positive benefits for the environmental justice communities. And while EJ impacts aren't specifically required to be taken into consideration under this regulatory structure, why should DAQ prioritize EJ issues in the state implementation update?
Yeah, so we definitely need to prioritize this within the SIP and continue to advocate for EJ in every single policy to reduce something that Joel touched upon, which is cumulative impacts. And this is something of a huge concern within EJ communities, and a concern for organizations such as us, Clean Air NC, and other organizations that work within the EJ sphere. because such impacts represent the reality of living in burdened communities where you have multiple factors such as socioeconomic, environmental, and health factors that combine to create negative effects in these communities. And because, as I mentioned, a lot of these communities that find themselves surrounded by industrial activities are low income and communities of color, this just puts a huge strain when you add the negative consequences of industrial activities. So we're talking about people in communities that are already dealing with a host of other issues. And through integrating EJ impacts and EJ considerations into this SIP, cumulative impacts will start to be addressed through the decline in emissions, and we'll hopefully start to see some improvements within our communities.
Awesome. Thank you.
As Ula had mentioned, the EPA has also clarified in its expectations that states include EJ concerns within their SIP. That was in the clarifying memo.
Great. Well, yeah, that kind of wraps up our questions, unless other people have any last questions that they want to ask our panelists before we end. So I'll give it another couple seconds if people want to put those in the chat box. Otherwise, I will say thank you so much for joining us tonight, guys, especially to our panelists. You know, this information really is helpful to kind of understand what the haze regulations are and really how to make our state implementation plan better for North Carolina and all of the citizens that live here. So it looks like we are looks like we're done with questions. Again, just to kind of reiterate what has been said a couple different times today, there is a public hearing coming up and there is an opportunity to provide public comment, either spoken or written. It looks like Ula has just kind of plugged that again in the chat. So for those of you that are on, please make sure you copy that down. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to any of us. Joel, Krista, Ula, Daisha, and Josh would be more than willing to answer all of your questions in any way that we can. So again, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and I hope you guys have a really great rest of your evening.